Well, he was a great dad. He would come across as being quite stoic, but he was just such a caring man.
Jerry was always present in our life. He was the kind of dad that would take us swimming, take us fishing, helping out in the community and letting us help out with him and Mom.
My mother and my father were both very giving people, and so I think, we hopefully we picked up some of that.
I think that he was always ready to lend a hand because maybe that's what his parents taught him. When the Korean War started and he and his brother were 16, 17, they decided they weren't good students and they were going to quit school, and Grandpa said, well, then you better get a job. And they didn't want to work in textiles, so they joined the Army.
Jerry never graduated from high school. As a junior, he and his brother Harry volunteered to join the Army, conned their parents into taking them down to the recruiter, signed a piece of paper that said, I know that my son is not the age of 18 yet, but I will allow them to join the military. The sense of patriotism, the love of country, and just the incredible sense of values that these men grew up with was something that had these two boys turning into men very quickly. If you look at the history of the Battle of Korea, it begins with the North invading the South in 1950, and it was a shock to everybody, and they were able to push the Allied forces back all the way to the southern end of Korea. And then, of course, General MacArthur came up with a brilliant idea about the Incheon landing, which put Allied forces behind the North Koreans and literally turned the tide of the war until China entered the war. And that would bring Jerry and his brother Harry, who both joined the military because of what they had seen going on in Asia. And in fact, Jerry was in combat at the age of 17, and the night that he was faced with the terrific challenges that he was when he was wounded, he was only 18 years old. He and his members of L Company of the 3rd Infantry Division were positioned along a series of mountains. We give them mountains numbers, and this was Hill 284. And they had defensive positions established to prevent the Chinese from overrunning their position and continuing on into the heart of the Allied forces. It was brutal fighting. It was hand-to-hand combat. On the evening of the 5th of September, 1951, Jerry was in a foxhole with 4 other of his soldiers trying to get a night's sleep. And at about 2 o'clock in the morning, he heard a sound, and it was a sound of metal scraping against rock. And he looked up and couldn't see anything because it was absolutely pitch dark. As he listened to what was going on, he heard a whistle, and he responded to that by laying down defensive fire. And about that time, there was a small skirmish that occurred, and the Chinese withdrew, defeated by the defenses of our soldiers. The next thing that happened was, got about 3 hours sleep, and about 5 o'clock in the morning, flares started going off, and bugles started to be played by the Chinese as a sort of psychological warfare against the U.S. troops who were stationed there. And then the full-out attack began. Jerry was in a foxhole, which was an artillery crater, with his other soldiers trying to defend against the attack from the Chinese. And as the Chinese worked their way up the mountain through the different levels of defensive wire that they had strung, they continued to get closer and closer, and of course the U.S. troops were defending themselves the best they could. Jerry had been wounded once before in combat in the leg, and he was returned to service, so he knew exactly what to face as these Chinese troops attacked them. And not only once, but twice did he leave his foxhole to retrieve one of his battle buddies who had happened to be wounded by the Chinese, got him back in safety into that shell hole that they called their foxhole. Once he also left the foxhole to attack Chinese who were trying to overrun a machine gun position. Of course, if the Chinese had captured it, they would have turned that on the U.S. troops. And then he returned back to his foxhole. And about this time, as he was helping the wounded soldiers who were with him, the next thing that he saw was this Chinese hand grenade that had been thrown unseen by a Chinese soldier into his foxhole, and without even giving it a second thought, he jumped on the hand grenade. The hand grenade went off, blew him about 3 feet in the air, turned him sideways, but he had saved the life of those men who were in the foxhole with him. And the next thing that happened was, as the medics made their way up to where he was, and of course all the U.S. troops saw this, and that sort of spurred them on that they were not going to let the Chinese overrun their positions. And the last thing that happened was, as the medical crew arrived where Jerry was in the foxhole with his soldiers who had survived the blast, he refused to be evacuated until the rest of the soldiers were removed from the foxhole. and then and only then did he permit himself to be removed. He served our country for 26 years and retired as a master sergeant. The effects of the hand grenade were with him through that time. Sheila tells me the story about he'll be sitting at dinner and his arm will start to bleed and he'll reach down and pull out a piece of shrapnel that had worked its way through his body, and at that point, some 10 years later, he'd just pick it up, go get a Band-Aid, put it on his hand, and finish dinner. Unfortunately, 6 months after he retired from the Army, the shrapnel caught up with him and he was killed by his body reacting to the shrapnel that was in his heart cavity, and he passed away instantly.
The town had wanted to do this Veterans Memorial with all veterans who from Cornelius or who even were affiliated in any way with Cornelius.
The American Legion said, something's missing here. We need a statue.
And they were going to do a generic statue, and a couple of the gentlemen who knew of my dad said, no, that's not what we need to do. This is what we need to do.
So he called me and he said, we want to use your dad as a representative of all military members, and if that's okay with you. And we're like, well, sure, you know.
Jerry Crump is on guard, and he's always on guard in this town, and he always was. And that's the pose they decided on, and that's why.
As the plaque before us reads, Corporal Crump demonstrated heroic devotion to duty, indomitable fighting spirit, and willingness to sacrifice himself to save his comrades. He was truly a hero of our age.
Dad taught us about service to others through all of his actions because he spent his life serving, and I think that stuck with Sheila and I.
If you look at the life of him and the people he influenced, not just on active duty, but even after he retired and returned here to North Carolina, there's not a person that I talk to of his age that doesn't remember Jerry Crump.
A really nice guy who really cared about others and really was a real asset to the community.
He is such a great figure, and all people who know him and their children, they know of him. I think he'll be remembered for the fine man that he was.
Well, it's pretty overwhelming now to think about what he did and what he went through at that age. He never talked about it. I think I was probably 7 or 8 years old before I even knew that he had a medal or anything, and that's because my cousin told me. I don't know that even when I was 20, if I realized, now I can really realize what a big deal it was.
Well, Jerry is very clearly one of my heroes because not only did he serve his country in combat in Korea, during his career he was asked to go back there 2 more times, representing the great sense of commitment to freedom that he demonstrated on that night in 1951.
The reasons that he stayed in speak more to him as a person than the reason he went in.
Medal of Honor recipients are the epitome of commitment to service. And if you just think about the incredible commitment that he had to his fellow soldiers, you can understand why President Truman presented him with the Medal of Honor a year later in 1952.
My dad will tell you that it was not his medal, that medal, he wore that medal for all the other service members through all the branches of service who didn't come home, who made a sacrifice, who did not receive the Medal of Honor for whatever reasons. It didn't matter if they were in combat or not. They were in service to their country. If they were in transportation, no matter what they were doing, they were in service to their country, and that's whose medal that is.
You don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to be a hero today. You wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to do the best I can with what I have, and I'm going to serve my country, and I'm going to take care of my fellow service members.